the silent dreams.
The door is not always there, but tonight it was very easy to find. This is sometimes how it goes, the door invisible for years, the person moving through their ordinary life, the door not needed, not sought, not even imagined. And then, a particular quality of night, a particular quality of silence in a room that was once full of something and is now not. And the door is simply there, in the way that things are simply there when they have always been there and you are only now able to see them. You walked through. That is enough. That required everything, and it was enough. The room is the same as it always is. 3 tables, 1 window, a candle on the table nearest to you. The flame is steady. The air is warm in the way of a room that has been warm for a very long time, not heated simply, inhabited. This room has been inhabited long enough that the warmth is structural now, part of what the walls are, part of what the wood holds. You are allowed to be here. You do not have to explain why. Sit down. The chair is solid. The table is solid. The candle will burn for as long as you need it to burn. There is no clock in this room, and there is no window onto a street, and there is nothing here that will remind you of the time, because time is not the point tonight. You are the point tonight. You and the particular quality of what you are carrying, and the room's willingness to hold it, all without asking anything in return. Sit. There is time. There is always time here. Sera came in and sat down, and did not move for a long time. This was not unusual in this room. The between had held many people who arrived and needed to do nothing for a while, who needed the simple permission of a chair and a table and an unhurried room to allow the body to stop performing its ordinary functions of forward motion and readiness, and the constant low-level management of being a person in the world, who was expected to continue being a person in the world. The performing was exhausting. Sera had been performing for some time now, not deceptively, not in the sense of pretending to feel things she did not feel or hiding what was true, but in the ordinary sense of performing that all grieving people do when they move through the world, the performance of continuation, of getting up in the morning, of answering questions, of eating because the body requires it, of sleeping or attempting to because the body requires that too, of showing up to the places where showing up was required and managing, in those places, to be enough of a person that the people around her were not frightened, were not burdened, were not required to do more than they were already doing. She had been enough of a person. It had cost a great deal. The between watched her sit and did not ask anything of her. It simply received her, in the way that this room received everyone without assessment, without the slight adjustment of atmosphere that rooms sometimes make when a particular kind of person enters, the subtle reorganization of expectation. The between did not reorganize. It remained exactly what it was and let Sera be exactly what she was, which was a person in the aftermath of something large, sitting in a chair, not yet ready to do anything but sit. She sat. The candle burned. The air in the room was warm. She had noticed this when she came in, not the warmth of a room that had just been heated, not the sharp warmth of a radiator or a fire recently lit, but the warmth of a room that had been inhabited long enough that the warmth was simply part of what the room was, structural warmth, warmth that lived in the walls and the floor and the wood of the table and chairs. She had stood for a moment at the threshold before sitting, registering this warmth, and something in her had responded to it in a way that bypassed thought entirely, some older, more animal part of her recognizing the warmth as safe, as not requiring anything, as simply available. She had sat down. The chair was solid, the kind of solid that was not merely the absence of give but something more active, the solidity of something that had been sat in many times and had learned through use to accommodate. She felt it accommodate her. Not dramatically, a slight settling, the chair receiving her weight in the way that well-made things receive weight, without protest, without performance. Simply, you are here and I am here and this is sufficient. She had not felt that recently, the sufficient. She had felt many things, the grief certainly, which was enormous and was doing what enormous things did, which was to make everything else feel provisional, uncertain, inadequately supported. She had felt the exhaustion of carrying the grief through days that required things of her regardless. She had felt the particular loneliness of being surrounded by people who cared about her and who were, despite their caring, not able to be inside the thing she was inside. She had felt, sometimes, the strange guilt of continuing, of eating breakfast, of laughing at something on a screen, of sleeping when sleep eventually came, as if these continuations were a betrayal of the scale of what had happened. She had not recently felt sufficient. The chair offered nothing except its own solid presence and the fact of holding her, and this was sufficient in the way that only very simple things could be sufficient, completely, without condition, without requiring anything back. She let herself be held by it. A glass of tea appeared on the table. She looked at it for a long time before touching it. The between noticed this, the looking, the particular quality of the looking, which was different from the looking that others had done in this room. This looking had a quality of distance to it, not disengagement. Something more like the looking of a person who is present in the room but whose awareness is also partially elsewhere, in another room, another time, the particular other time that exists for grieving people, always slightly alongside the present, the time that was before, the time that contained the thing that was now absent. She was looking at the tea and also not looking at it. She was here and also somewhere else. The between did not try to pull her fully into the present. This was not what she needed. What she needed was exactly what the room was providing, a place to be both here and there simultaneously, without being required to choose, without the exhausting work of forcing the present to be the only place. The present was not the only place. The between had always known this. People moved through time in one direction, but they inhabited it in all directions simultaneously. The past always present in the body, in the hands, in the particular way, a person's face held the residue of everything that had shaped it. Sera was continuous with everything that had come before tonight, everything that had come before the loss, everything that was now carrying the particular weight of having been and being no longer, of having been so completely part of the fabric of a life that its absence had changed the texture of everything. She reached for the glass. Both hands, the familiar gesture. The warmth moved into her palms, and she held it there, and the between watched and said nothing. There are many kinds of silence. The between knew this better than most, having held so many of them over such a long time. There was the silence of anticipation, a silence with edges, a silence that was really just the space between one sound and the next, taut with what was coming. There was the silence of completion, which was softer, a silence that did not lean forward because there was nothing ahead to lean toward, a silence that simply rested in what had just been. There was the silence of two people who had run out of words and were comfortable in the absence of them. There was the silence of a room that had never been filled, the thin, uninhabited silence of a space that had not yet been breathed in. And then there was this silence. The silence of after. It was the heaviest silence the between had ever held, and it had held it many times, and it was still the heaviest. Not because it was loud, it was the opposite of loud, being the most complete absence of sound, the silence that arrived when the particular sounds of a particular life were no longer there to fill the air, but heavy in the sense of density. The silence of after was dense with the shape of what was missing. It had contour. You could feel it the way you felt the shape of something in the dark, not by seeing it, but by the absence of the space it displaced, by the negative impression it left in the air around it. The thing that was gone had displaced a great deal of air. Sera sat in the shape of that absence. The between sat with her. The between thought about how people talked about grief, the language that had grown up around it, the frameworks and the stages and the metaphors, the tunnel with the light at the end, the waves, the journey. These were not wrong, they were attempting to describe something that resisted description, and the attempts were honest and kind. But they all implied to some degree that grief was a passage, a process with a beginning and a middle and an end, a road that led somewhere, a tunnel that concluded in light. The between was not certain this was true. Not because it did not believe that grief changed. It had watched grief change in the people who brought it here, had watched it become, over time, different in character even when it did not diminish in presence. But the change was not the change of passing through. It was more like the change of incorporation. The grief became part of the person rather than something the person passed through. It became part of how they saw things, part of the particular quality of their attention, part of what they knew about the world that they had not known before. This was not a bad thing. It was a real thing. The between held Sera and her silence and the particular shape of what she was carrying, and it did not tell her any of this. She was not here for frameworks. She was here for the chair and the table and the warmth and the unhurried room and the candle that burned without asking her to look at it. She looked at it anyway. The flame was steady, steadier than seemed possible, in a room that had a quality of having been breathed in by many people over many years. But the flame was steady, in the way that things in the between were steady, not as the absence of motion, but as the presence of something that moved continuously and remained, through all its moving itself. She looked at the flame. She breathed. She had not cried tonight. This was not unusual. Grief did not always arrive as tears. The between had learned this, had watched enough of it to understand that grief took many forms, that it did not keep to a schedule, that it arrived and receded and arrived again in its own rhythms, which bore no reliable relationship to the rhythms a person might expect or wish for, or have been told to expect by the people who offered their understanding and their kindness and their careful frameworks for what grief was supposed to look like. Grief rarely looked like the frameworks. It looked like sitting in a chair in a candle-lit room at an unnameable hour, holding a glass of tea, not crying, not thinking particularly clearly, not doing anything except being a person who had lost something and was still here, still breathing, still occupying space in the world continuing to be the world with a generosity and an indifference that could feel, at certain moments, almost unbearable. The world's continuation. This was the hard part, not the moment of loss itself, though that was also hard, but the after, the way the world simply went on. The way the mornings continued to arrive, the light changing in the way it always changed, as if nothing had shifted. The way other people's lives continued their ordinary motion. The way she herself continued, the body insisting on its own perpetuation regardless of whether perpetuation felt, at every moment, like the obvious choice. The body continued. She had let it. She was here in this room, which meant she had let it, which meant something, the between thought, which meant that the continuation had been chosen, at some level below the level of conscious choosing, chosen in the way the body chooses to breathe even when the mind has forgotten to direct it. She was here. The between received this as the significant fact that it was. She drank the tea slowly. One sip, and then a pause, and then another sip, the pace of someone who is not particularly thirsty, but is using the tea the way people sometimes use physical things in moments of emotional extremity, as something to do with the hands, as a small manageable action in the middle of an experience that is too large for action, as evidence that the body still knows how to perform its simple functions even when the larger systems are overtaxed. The hands knew how to hold a glass. The mouth knew how to drink. These things continued. She had been surprised early on by the continuations, by the fact that the body insisted on its needs with a cheerful indifference to what the mind was experiencing. Hunger arrived at its usual times. Thirst arrived. The body requested sleep even when sleep felt impossible, and achieved it even when the mind was convinced it would not. There had been something almost offensive about this. In the first weeks, the body's refusal to understand the scale of what had happened, its insistence on its own agenda. Now she was grateful for it. The body's insistence had carried her through days she would not otherwise have navigated. The hunger that said, eat, the thirst that said, drink, the exhaustion that said, lie down even if you do not sleep. The body had been her companion through this in a way she had not expected, not a comforting companion, not one that offered solace, but a faithful one. It had continued to do what it did. It had not abandoned her. She held the glass. The warmth was there. The between thought about what remained after, not in any mystical sense, in the simpler sense, what remained in the living person in the world after someone or something had gone from it. More than people sometimes thought. This was what the between had observed, over its long tenure of witnessing the aftermath of loss. People often arrived expecting to find themselves emptied, expecting that the loss, which had felt so total, which had taken up so much of the interior space, would leave behind it a vacancy, a Sera-shaped space now hollow at the center, the thing that had been removed leaving only its negative impression. But this was not what happened. What the loss left behind was not emptiness but something more complicated, a changed arrangement of what was already there. The grief was real and the absence was real, and these were not small things. But alongside them, threaded through them, sometimes indistinguishable from them, were also all the things the relationship had given, the particular ways of seeing that had been learned, the references that existed only because both people had been present for the same thing, the habits that had been shaped by the presence of another, the parts of herself that had grown in a particular direction because of who she had grown alongside. These remained. They were hers now, entirely hers in a way they had not been before, because before they had been shared, had existed in the space between two people, and now they existed only in her. The between did not say this to Sera. It did not offer frameworks or consolations. It only held the thought quietly in the air of the room and let the room's air be what it was. She thought about small things. This was something that had happened since, the attention having shifted, or having been forced to shift, from the large structures of a life to the smaller components. Before, she had moved through the world with the confidence of someone who had the large structures in place, the relationship, the shape of the future, the particular arrangements that constituted a life built alongside another person. These had provided a kind of scaffolding that allowed the small things to be taken for granted. The scaffolding was gone. What remained were the small things, and she had found in the weeks since that the small things were actually quite large. The particular light through the kitchen window in the mornings, the sound of rain on the roof in the night, the taste of coffee, the particular smell of a room she had been in often. These things had not changed. They were still there, and without the scaffolding of the larger structure they were very present, very particular, very specifically themselves. The tea in her hands was very specific. The warmth of it was very specific. She held it and was held by it, and let the specificity be what it was. She drank her tea. The candle burned. The surface of the table was in front of her. She had been looking at it without seeing it, the way eyes rest on surfaces when the mind is elsewhere, using the visual field as a kind of neutral ground, a place to point the gaze that makes no demands. Gradually, the table came into focus. The grain of the wood, the old marks, the particular way the candlelight moved across the surface, catching the raised edges of the grain and leaving the softer parts in shadow, so that the table became, in this light, a landscape of its own, a terrain of ridge and valley, amber and dark, old and used and marked by everything that had rested on it. She put her free hand on the table, not the hand holding the glass, the other hand, palm down, fingers loose. The wood was cool at first contact and then not cool, the warmth exchanging in the familiar way. The between noticed this, the hand on the table, had noticed it with Mara, had noticed it with Arden. There was something about this room and this table that made people reach for it, that made the hand seek the surface. Perhaps it was the table's age. The way very old things have a quality of having outlasted so much that touching them provides a kind of reassurance. The wordless knowledge that the table was here before and will be here after, that its duration has nothing to do with the duration of any particular person, but simply with the fact of being well-made wood in a room that takes care of what is in it. She pressed her palms slightly harder against the surface. Not gripping, just pressing, applying a small amount of weight, making contact more complete. The table held the pressure and gave nothing back except the solid, patient, unhurried fact of its own presence. This was enough. Sometimes a solid surface beneath the hand is enough, not a solution, not a comfort in any complex sense, simply the undeniable evidence of something present and real and holding still while everything else moves and changes and disappears. The table was present. Sera was present. The between held them both. She stayed like that for a long time, both palms on the table, both eyes unfocused, the breath slow and the room quiet and the candle doing its patient work nearby. The between did not hurry this. It never hurried anything, but this in particular, the long, unhurried sitting of a grieving person who had finally arrived at a place that asked nothing of them, it held with particular care. She was doing something important, even though it looked like nothing. She was resting, not sleeping, the active, busy, never quite right rest of the grieving person who lay in the dark and felt the weight of the knowledge, who surfaced and surfaced again through the night without arriving at the deep level where restoration actually happened. This was different. This was the rest of a person who had stopped completely, the performance of not resting, who was simply here in the warmth, with the hands on the table and the breath moving at its own pace, and no requirement to be anywhere except exactly here. The between knew what this cost. Stopping costs more than continuing sometimes. Continuing has its own momentum, Each minute of the performance makes the next minute of the performance more possible, the body finding its rhythm in the maintaining, the motion itself providing a kind of stability. Stopping breaks that rhythm. Stopping requires the person to be in the stillness without the motion to manage it, without the forward movement to forestall the full weight of what is being carried. She had stopped. She was in the stillness. The between was glad she had come. She thought about hands, not her own other hands, the particular hands of the person who was no longer here. The way hands are one of the most individual things about a person, one of the things most impossible to generalize, most resistant to the language of type or category. Hands are always specifically someone's hands shaped by their particular life, their particular work, their particular way of moving through the world. She had known those hands, had known them in the particular way of someone who has been in proximity to another person for long enough that the details of them are simply known, registered without effort, present in the memory not as images but as felt things, as the knowledge of what a particular pressure felt like, what a particular gesture looked like from across a room. She knew those hands. She would continue to know them, the between thought. Memory of this kind did not fade in the way that intellectual memory faded, the way dates and facts and the specific content of conversations faded, replaced by impression and summary. The memory of a person's hands was different. It lived in the body. It was held not in the place where words were held, but in the place where touch was held, the place that kept the knowledge of how the world felt rather than how it looked or what it said. She would carry this, not as a burden, or not only as a burden, as a form of continuation, as the way that people who were gone continued to exist in the people who had known them, not as ghosts, not in any mystical sense, but in the very practical sense of having shaped the person they had known, having left their particular impression on the way that person moved through the world, thought about things, held their hands on a table in the middle of a sleepless night in an unhurried room. Sera was shaped by what she had lost. The shaping remained. The between held this thought carefully, not offering it, simply holding it in the warm air of the room. She had not known what she was coming here for. This was often the case. People did not know what they were coming to the between for until they were here, until the room had had time to work its particular form of clarification, which was not the clarification of answer but the clarification of presence. Simply being here, in this specific quality of stillness, made some things clearer. Not the large things, the between made no promises about the large things, the questions that had no answers, the losses that did not resolve, the grief that did not conclude, but the smaller things, the things that had been obscured by the constant motion and the constant performance and the constant management of being a person who was still here when part of what had made being here feel like a complete thing was now absent. She had not known she was tired. This was the first thing the room clarified. She was very tired. Not the tired of a sleepless night, though she had had many of those. Not the tired of the body's legitimate need for rest, though that was also true. The tired she felt now, sitting in this chair with the warm glass in her hands and the old table beneath her palm and the candle steady in its small circle of amber light, was a different kind of tired. The tired of sustained effort. The tired of the performance of continuation. The tired of being, day after day, enough. She had been enough. She could stop for tonight. The between did not say this. It did not speak in words to its visitors, not usually. But it communicated it in the way that rooms communicate things, through temperature, through light, through the particular quality of the silence which tonight had a permissive quality to it. A silence that said, nothing is required here, not the being okay, not the moving forward, not the brave face or the grateful heart or the philosophical acceptance. Not any of the things that she had been assembling daily, piece by piece, and carrying into the world as evidence that she was managing, that she was getting through it, that she was the person people needed her to be. Here she was only herself. Whatever that was tonight. The between was not certain it could be named. The particular state of a person in grief at this particular hour in this particular room, the mixture of exhaustion and something that was not quite sadness but was sadness's quieter cousin, the way the body felt heavy and also oddly weightless, the way thinking was difficult and also unnecessary, the way the present moment was both very near and very far. This did not have a clean name. She did not need it to have one. She needed only to be in it here, with the candlelight and the warm glass and the solid table, and the room that would not ask her to be anything except what she was. Her breathing had slowed. She had not noticed this happening. She rarely noticed breathing while it was happening, in the ordinary course of things, the breath being one of those fundamental processes that conducted itself below the level of attention most of the time. But she noticed it now. The breath was slower than it had been when she came in, slower and lower. The breath of a body that was releasing some of what it had been holding, releasing it gradually, without drama. The slow exhalation of tension that had become so constant it had stopped registering as tension, and had simply become the neutral condition of her chest. The chest was less tight than it had been. Not much less, a small difference, but the between noticed small differences, had been noticing them for a very long time, had learned that the small differences were the ones that mattered most, that the large dramatic releases were less common and less lasting than the small incremental ones. That grief resolved to the extent that it resolved at all, not in single moments of catharsis, but in the accumulation of many small moments of slightly less. The gradual process of a body learning to carry a weight that was not going to go away but was, with time and rest and the patient passage of days, becoming more familiar, more incorporated, more simply part of the weight of being who she was now. She was not the person she had been before. She would not be that person again. This was not a failure. It was not a tragedy, though it felt like one sometimes, the loss of the self that had existed before the loss. It was simply what happened to people who loved things and then lost them. They became unavoidably the people who had loved and lost. This was added to them, not subtracted. Added, which was heavier, yes, but also in time, also different from only heavier. In time. Tonight was not that time. Tonight was only for sitting. The candle burned. The between turned its attention to the candle, in the long quiet of Sera's sitting, in the way that attention moves in a room where the primary presence has become very still, seeking the small motion, the small ongoing thing, the thing that was continuing to do what it did regardless of what anything else was doing. The candle continued. It had no knowledge of what had happened in Sera's life. It had no relationship to her loss. It burned because burning was what it did, and it did this with a completeness that was, the between had always thought, instructive, though it offered no instructions. The candle was entirely itself. It was doing the only thing it knew how to do, and it was doing it without reservation, without holding anything back, without managing its burning or performing it or maintaining it beyond what was simply natural to what it was. The candle did not wonder if it was burning correctly. It did not compare its burning to the burning of other candles. It simply burned. The flame moved the small, constant, microsecond adjustments that a flame made to the air around it, the continuous negotiation between fire and oxygen, the most ancient conversation in any room. The flame was not still, but it was steady. Its motion was not the motion of agitation or urgency, but of something continuously adapting, continuously present, continuously finding the balance between what it needed and what was available. And this balance was not fixed but was found and found again, moment to moment, without effort and without anxiety. This was perhaps the truest and most common form of steadiness. Not the steadiness of something that never moved, but the steadiness of something that moved constantly and remained, through all its moving, oriented toward the same thing. The candle was oriented toward burning. Sera was oriented toward. The between did not finish this thought. It did not know what Sera was oriented toward tonight in the immediate aftermath of what she had been through. She might not know either. That was acceptable. The orientation did not need to be named in order to be present. It was there in the fact of her being here, in the fact of the hands on the glass, and the glass warm and the palm on the table and the breath slowly, gradually, incrementally releasing what it had been holding. She was oriented toward continuing. She might not know it yet, but she was. The light from the candle fell across the table and across her hands and across the surface of the glass, and the light was amber, the particular amber of a candle that had been burning for some time, the amber that was not the bright clean yellow of a new flame but the deeper, warmer, more complex color of a flame that had settled into itself, that had moved past its first brightness into something more substantial. She was looking at the light, not examining it, not thinking about it, simply looking, the eyes resting on the color the way eyes rest on color when they have given up on finding anything specific to focus on, and have accepted instead the simpler task of receiving what was there. The color was warm. The warm was simple. The simple was enough. The between let her look for as long as she needed to look. The tea was nearly finished. She had been drinking it slowly, more slowly than she realized, the sips spaced far apart by long stretches of sitting and looking, and the particular slow passage of time that happens in rooms where time has been released from its ordinary function of urgency, and allowed to simply move at its own pace, which was slower than she was used to. She drank the last of it, held the empty glass for a moment, then set it down. Her hands returned to the table, both of them now, both palms down, both slightly spread, the position of a person not holding anything, the position of a person whose hands were free. She had been holding things for a long time. Not just tonight, long before tonight, the holding had been her primary occupation, though she would not have called it that, would have called it by other names. Love, commitment, presence, showing up. These were the right names. But they were also forms of holding, and the holding had been sustained over years, and the years had the particular quality of years in which you are fully present for another person, in which your own ongoing life is braided with another's, in which the texture of your days is shaped by the presence and the needs and the particular qualities of someone else. That braiding had come undone. Not because anything was wrong with it, it had been strong and real and good, simply because one end of it was gone, and when one end of a braid is gone, the braid cannot continue to be a braid. It becomes something else. Single strands, perhaps, or the between thoughts something new, something that had not yet been named because it had not yet been fully formed. She was in the process of becoming something new. She did not know this yet, or knew it only in the way you know things before you know them, sensed without being able to articulate, felt without being able to name. The between knew it the way a room knows things, from the quality of what it held, from the texture of the air, from the particular temperature of a presence that was, underneath all the weight and the exhaustion and the grief, fundamentally intact. She was intact. The between was certain of this. Not the same as before, that person was genuinely gone, genuinely changed by what had happened, and to pretend otherwise would be a different kind of loss, the loss of the truth of what grief did, but intact in the deeper sense of, still here, still breathing, still holding a glass and setting it down and placing both hands on a table and feeling the cool wood and exchanging warmth with it, and being, in this moment, a living person in a room that was glad to have her. The between was glad to have her. She thought about the mornings. Not tomorrow's morning specifically. She had learned not to think too far ahead, had learned that the horizon needed to stay close, that looking too far forward produced a particular vertigo that the close horizon did not produce. She had learned to think in units of today, the next few hours, the next meal, small enough to be manageable, small enough that the weight of the whole future did not land on the present at once. But she thought about mornings in the general sense. The quality of mornings now compared to before. Before, mornings had been the beginning, the natural starting point of a day that had shape and direction, a day that moved toward things, that had its own momentum. She had not needed to will the mornings. They arrived and she moved into them, and the day unfolded in the way that days unfolded for people who had the structure of another person's life woven through their own. Now mornings were different. They arrived the same way. The light changed outside the window in the same gradual progression. The body woke in the same sequence. But the moment of waking had a particular quality now, the brief suspension before the knowing, the 2 or 3 seconds in which she was simply a person waking in a room without any specific weight, and then the knowing returning, the full weight of it settling back into the chest like something that had been momentarily lifted and was now back in its place. Every morning the between knew this sequence, had held people who were in the middle of it, had watched them carry the weight of the morning re-knowing every day, the way you carry something that cannot be set down but must be carried, that requires only to be carried, not to be solved or resolved or transformed, but simply borne with as much grace as was available. She bore it with a great deal of grace. More than she knew. The between thought about grace. Not in the religious sense, though it did not exclude that sense either, but in the simpler sense, the quality that appears in people who are carrying very heavy things and are still in the carrying, recognizably themselves, still capable of warmth, still capable of attention, still capable of the small kindnesses and the moments of genuine connection that made a life rather than simply a duration. Grace was not the absence of the weight. Grace was the presence of the person alongside it. Sera had grace. She did not know she had it. The people who had it rarely did. The knowledge of it being incompatible with the quality itself, which required a kind of unself-consciousness to exist. But the between could see it clearly from where it sat, which was everywhere in the room at once, which was the walls and the floor and the warm air and the steady flame. The grace of a person who was fully inside a very hard thing and was still, inside it, entirely herself. This was not a small thing. The between held it with care, the way it held everything, without possessing, without requiring, simply present for it while it was here to be present for. Her eyes were heavy. Not the heaviness of sadness, though sadness was there, always there now, a weather she moved through rather than a condition she passed in and out of. The heaviness was different, the heaviness of a body that had been holding itself together for a long time and was, in the presence of a room that asked nothing of it, beginning to release. The heaviness of the eyelids when they stopped being required to stay open. The heaviness of the shoulders when they stopped being required to hold a shape. The between spoke, not aloud, not in words, but in the way the room spoke, which was in warmth and stillness and the quality of the light. You are allowed to rest. Not from the grief, grief does not rest, and it would not serve you to pretend it did, but from the managing of it, from the performing of it, from the daily work of being a person who is carrying this and is also required to be a person in the world. Here, you are not required to be a person in the world. Here, you are only required to be what you are, which is enough, which has always been enough, which will, in ways you cannot yet see, continue to be enough. The candle was lower. The light was softer. Her eyes were closed now, or nearly, the lids heavy and not lifting, the breath slow, the hands loose on the table. The between let the quiet do the rest. She slept. The sleep came gently, not the sudden drop of absolute exhaustion, but the slow descent of a person who had been allowed, finally, to stop holding themselves at the surface. Like something released into water, not sinking, but finding its own level. The level that was available without effort. The level that the body sought when it was not being held above it by will. She slept. The between watched. It thought about what sleep meant for the grieving. For most people, sleep was primarily a physical event. The body's maintenance cycle, the consolidation of memory, the restoration of the systems that waking life depleted. For grieving people it was also something else, the only reliable reprieve. The only hours in which the awareness of the loss receded, not because the mind had stopped knowing what it knew, but because in sleep the knowing operated differently, as dream material, as texture, as a quality of the sleeping, rather than a thought the sleeping person was required to manage. She would wake. She would wake and the loss would return in the way it returned every morning, the brief window of not yet knowing in the first seconds of consciousness, and then the return, the re-knowing, the body's reaccommodation of the weight of what was missing. This happened every morning. It would happen tomorrow morning. It would happen for a long time. But tonight she was sleeping. And sleep was its own complete thing. Not a pause before more grief, not a rest stop on the way to more waking difficulty, but a complete thing in its own right, a night of her own life, a night that was real and was hers, and in which her body was doing what it knew how to do. Her hands were open on the table. The between noticed this, the openness of them, the slight natural curl of the fingers, the easy spread of the palms. Hands in sleep were different from hands in waking. The waking hand was always slightly engaged, slightly ready, its musculature maintained at a baseline of readiness even during rest. The sleeping hand released this readiness. It became simply a hand, the shape of a hand, the weight of a hand, the particular warmth of a hand that is not doing anything except existing. These hands had done a great deal. The between did not know the specifics, what work they had done, what they had held, what care they had given. But hands carried their history in their shape, in the way use shaped them over years, and these hands had the particular quality of hands that had been in service of others for a long time, that had given more than they had received, that had been the hands someone else came to and found what they needed there. They were resting now. The between was glad of this. The candle burned lower. The light was softer than it had been at the beginning of the night, the amber deeper, the circle of illumination smaller, the shadows at the edges of the room deeper and more complete. The between did not find this diminishing. A candle in its later hours was not a failing candle. It was a candle that had been burning for a long time, that had given everything it had to give, that had warmed the air and lit the table and held the company of the people who had sat beneath it, and was now arriving, gradually, at the natural conclusion of what it was for. There was nothing sad about this. There was, if anything, something complete about it, the completeness of a thing that had done its work fully and was now, in the doing of it, reaching its end. The between thought about ends. Not abstractly, very specifically. The end of this night. The end of the candle. The end of the particular silence that Sera had brought into this room, which had been held here and which had been, if not resolved, then witnessed, which was sometimes the same thing. The end of the night's particular work. But also, the end as a form of completion. The way things that ended had, in their ending, a kind of wholeness that things still in progress did not. The night would end. It would always have been this particular night of this particular candle and this particular sleeping woman, and this particular silence that the room had held with all of its accumulated patience and warmth. The ending would not take that away. The ending would simply add the completion. It was a good night. The between had known many good nights. This was one. She would wake at some point and leave. She would step out into whatever was outside this room, which would be the world, which would be the same world it had been when she arrived, still asking things of her, still requiring the performance of continuation, still moving at its own pace regardless of the pace of her grief. She would be in it again. But she would have had this. The between did not traffic in certainties about what the future held. It had been present for enough futures to know that certainty was not available, that people who left this room went on to things it could not predict and would not claim to be able to predict. But it knew this, that the particular hours of a night spent held in a room that asked nothing were not nothing. They were not a cure, and they were not a solution, and they were not the end of grief, or the lightening of it in any immediate sense. But they were real. They were a real night in a real life. And real nights accumulated, the way all real things accumulated, becoming part of the texture of a life, part of what a life had been, part of what it was to be the particular person who had lived it. This night would become part of Sera. The warmth of the room, the coolness of the table, the glass of tea, the steady candle, the particular quality of being held without being asked anything. All of this would become part of her, added to everything else that had become part of her, including the grief, including the loss, including the love that had preceded both. She would carry it. The between was glad it would be carried. The candle burned. Sera slept. The room breathed. Sleep, the between said to the room, to the candle, to the cool air near the window and the warm air near the flame, to the hands open on the table. Sleep, there is nothing required of you tonight. There is time, there is always time here. Closing ritual. The door is not always there. But tonight it found you. You came in carrying the particular weight of after, that specific gravity that settles into a life when something that was part of the structure of the life is no longer there. The weight is real. The between does not ask you to set it down, because it is not a weight that can be set down. It is part of you now, in the way that anything truly loved becomes part of the person who loved it, present in the body, in the hands, in the way the eyes move through a room. You carry it. You will continue to carry it. But tonight, in this room, at this table, with the candle that burns without requiring an audience and the warmth that dispersed from the glass into the air and into everything, tonight you can carry it from a sitting position. You do not have to hold yourself upright for it. The chair will hold you upright. The table is here. The floor is here, the old floor, the stone beneath the wood, the earth beneath the stone, all of it arranged in its patient and faithful way to hold whatever is on it, to hold you, to hold the weight of everything you carry, without effort, without end. You are held, not by the room alone, by everything you have ever been held by, every person, every place, every hour that was kind to you, every moment when the weight was lighter than you expected, every morning that arrived when you were not certain it would. All of that is still here in you as part of what you are. The grief does not erase it. The grief is added to it. Both are true. Both are held. Let the table take the weight of your hands. Let the chair take the weight of your body. Let the breath slow out longer than it came in. The fall of it, the long fall of the exhale, into the warmth of the room, the warmth that is yours now, that you gave to it, and that it gives back. Let the eyes close. Let the weight be held. Let the candle burn without your watching it. It will burn. The room will be here. The floor will hold. And you, in the morning, will still be here. That is enough. Tonight, that is everything.